Hey, Magnus here. Now to get started, I recently was in a coffee shop, Goat Coffee House, and I just wanted to talk about the subject and actually use the 5D Mark IV in some of the features that we're going to talk about today. So, here it is. Hey everyone, Magnus here, and today I'm outside of Goat Coffee House going to talk about the 5D Mark IV again and how this camera could possibly compete with cameras today that have similar or better features. Now we talk about IBIS, we talk about a flip screen, we talk about all of that, but when you bought this camera already and spent the money that you needed to actually use it, and you want to vlog like everyone else does, and you spent a lot of money on this camera, can it still compete? Well, let's find out for a few settings that you can actually do on other cameras and how you could simulate or have the same feature on the 5D. Let's go inside. It's probably a little less noisy in there anyway. So many cars. Behind you with like the clouds, the sky and everything, and still be able to see. We've got the Rode video mic. Here we go. M50. What do you guys think? First and foremost, if you're new to my channel, please subscribe if you like hearing about cameras, specifically mirrorless and DSLR cameras for video. And I talk about that stuff, hacks and whatever. So check it out, and if you like, please subscribe. Now, speaking of the 5D Mark IV, one of its main downfalls when compared to some full-frame mirrorless cameras of today, such as the Nikon Z6 or the A7III, is that it can do 4K, but it doesn't do 4K full frame. And that's unfortunate. Full frame 4K is starting to become pretty common and easily attainable, and you're having manufacturers trying to push their full frame 4K as much as possible. Like Nikon, like Sony, and even though maybe on the Sony you have a slight crop depending on how you're using it, it's still pretty much almost full frame when compared to the 5D Mark IV that has a 1.74 times crop. So sad. But with that argument, a lot of that full frame, besides the shallow depth of field, which you can definitely work around the shallow depth of field, is the fact that you've got to struggle is if you're going to do like a selfie type of thing where you're just pointing the camera at yourself, it gets difficult because of that crop factor. The camera would be like in your face. Well, you buy the right lens, and this is a Tokine 11 to 20 millimeter lens, f2.8, and I've talked about this lens a lot in my previous videos. It can get you a pretty good wide shot. I mean, if you look at this footage here where I just held the camera up to my face and started recording, you can see that I fit in a frame just fine. So when it comes to the fact that it's too cropped in, you can definitely work around that with the right lens. And quite honestly, the fact that it does dual pixel autofocus in 4K, similar to that of the EOS-R, is great. Now the next drama that you've got going on is IBIS. There are some cameras like the Sony and the GH5 that actually have IBIS built in body image stabilization, and that makes filming a lot easier. It makes it so if you're doing a handheld shot, it reduces a lot of that shake, and you get almost gimbal-like improvements, or do you? Now when it comes to IBIS, I know that having optical image stabilization is not as good as having a combination of both of them, but it's pretty darn good on the 5D Mark IV, and when you compare it to using any type of IBIS in other cameras, the truth of the matter is that IBIS, in my opinion, it helps, but it's not anything that you can't work around with any camera that you have, including the 5D Mark IV. You've got image stabilization in the lens. You can actually use the Zhiyun Crane 2 to really get smooth gimbal shots, and the ability to have a gimbal is a plus benefit, and that in itself reduces the actual need. I mean, you're either going to pay, it's not worth paying another couple of $1,000s for a new camera just for IBIS when you can have it already with a combination of lenses and a gimbal. Now, gimbals can be expensive, but it's up to you. The point is, you can actually work around the lack of IBIS in the 5D Mark IV, so it won't damage your shot. Now, I'm going to move on to the lack of a flip screen on the 5D Mark IV. Now, that unfortunately can lead to vlogging difficulties because you want to see yourself and make sure you've got yourself framed, but you don't have it on the 5D Mark IV. But you do have it on other competing cameras. And Canon's new cameras, they realize that the need for a flip screen is pretty important. But if you've got the 5D, is it worth paying another couple of $1,000s on a new camera just to see yourself? Well, the workaround on the 5D that I tend to do, and actually I would almost prefer, even on a camera where I don't have a flip screen, not to even use it. Maybe I could use it to frame myself at first, but then before I hit that record button, I turn it off. For example, like Casey Neistat, have you noticed that he wears sunglasses in a lot of his videos? The reason that he does that is because as he's vlogging, his eyes will tend to float to the side. They'll just look at what's next to him. It'll kind of ruin the shot, and he won't be talking to you as much as he is checking out how he looks. And that's the problem. When you have a flip screen, it can be a distraction. And the other downside about a flip screen, especially if you've got distance between you and the camera, is that it's so small. It's almost pointless to have a flip screen when you're incredibly small. You can tell if you're centered or not, but you can't tell if you're in focus. You can't see anything else. What I tend to do is that I will look at the 5D Mark IV and the lens, making sure that the lens position is looking at me but slightly pointed down. Based off of that habit, no matter what lens, and even though I can't see myself, and thanks to the trusted dual pixel autofocus of the 5D, I know I'm in focus, so the only thing I have to worry about is framing. And as long as the lens is pointed slightly down but pointed directly towards me, I know that I'm framed correctly to what I want to be framed at. So that's not an issue. And I've also become familiar with working with how many millimeters that I'm shooting, how close or far I'm at. So it does take a little bit of know-how of recognizing your cameras and what your lenses do for you. But when you got that, you can basically get used to not even worrying about it. When I stick my 11 to 20 millimeter f2.8 lens on the 5D, I'm usually good without a flip screen. On some cases where I'm standing far and I really do need to make sure the proper framing is taking place, especially if I want something else on camera, you can connect your phone to the 5D Mark IV and then just look at yourself right here, and you don't have to have that screen so far. So you could just look at yourself and make sure you're in focus and the framing's right and go from there. And that's done wirelessly. And finally, you do have the option, thanks to the HDMI port or the mini HDMI port, you can just connect a monitor to it and make that screen bigger. So there's still workarounds that you can do without the need to spend more money just to get a flip screen. And then finally, we have the slow-mo. Now, slow-mo is something important to filmmakers who want to film that nice B-roll. We all like that B-roll. You want to film it to the point where it looks really good. And unfortunately, the 5D Mark IV does 120 frames per second only in 720p. And that 120 frames per second has no audio or autofocus when you're recording as such. So you can't get that. But quite honestly, the 120 frames per second in 720p doesn't look that bad. Did you notice that some of that slow motion shots that I got in the shop were in 720p? Maybe, maybe not. Normally I can't tell unless I put them side by side. Then I could be like, okay, that was 720p versus 1080p. But for the most part, when you're trying to produce something and get that right look, you should be able to work with what you have and then adjust for that need. So you do get 120 frames per second on the 5D Mark IV, and you also have the ability to record 60 frames per second if you only want to slow down about 60% and get that nice, almost half the speed in slow motion if you're outputting to 24p, and still get a nice looking image. Even slow motion, you do get off the 5D Mark IV. Some limitations, but when you know how to work around those limitations, you can still get a great shot. But what do you guys think of the 5D Mark IV? Yeah, it's got limitations. Yeah, you gotta work around it. But are those extra features worth the price of another couple $1,000s in a new camera? Only you guys can decide. Me personally, I have made purchases. I got the GH5 because I wanted the IBIS and the 4K 60. I got the BMPCC 4K because I wanted raw recording, 12-bit 444. I wanted those extra features. But if you don't have it and you've got the 5D, you can still get great images with what you have. And that's my point. Let me know what you guys think in the comments down below. As always, like, share, and you can make my day if you subscribe today. This is Magnus, and I'm out. Next time I gotta talk about that Canon SL3. You probably don't need to buy it. See you later.